Well, good morning, and thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to Georgetown and to Gaston Hall. For more than almost a century and a half, this auditorium has been one of the most vibrant fora for public discourse and discussion in our nation's capital, and today we continue this important tradition with a dialogue on faith, culture, and the common good. This engagement, as the first Courtyard of the Gentiles conference hosted in the United States, is strengthened by the leadership of our partners, the Pontifical Council for Culture at the Vatican and the Archdiocese of Washington, in collaboration with members of the Georgetown University community. We're deeply grateful for this partnership and for the spirit of goodwill that they bring to these conversations on faith, culture, and society. I'd especially like to thank Cardinal Ravasi, the president of the Pontifical Council for Culture, and Cardinal Wuerl, our Archbishop here in Washington, who I'll have the privilege of introducing in just a moment. I'd also like to extend my deep gratitude to John Borelli, Tom Banchoff, our colleagues at the Berkeley Center here at Georgetown for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and many other colleagues across our campus for their contributions on behalf of the Georgetown community. We come together today as, quote, communities united by different bonds, but above all and essentially by culture, close quote. That's the guiding vision of this conference. With these words, Pope John Paul II established the Pontifical Council for Culture over 3 decades ago. And these words continue to animate the inclusive dialogue that characterizes the Courtyard of the Gentiles today. Coming together in a dialogue such as this is an opportunity for us to see the moral commitments and values that we hold in common, to recognize the experience of the human condition, to realize that what we share is far greater than what separates us. Our shared engagement with culture brings us together. Our commitment to dialogue deepens our bonds, and our understanding of each other provides a foundation for our work towards the common good. Pope Francis speaks to these themes and to the shared commitments between people of faith and people of goodwill in his apostolic exhortation, The Joy of the Gospel, writing, as believers, we also feel close to those who do not consider themselves part of any religious tradition, yet sincerely seek the truth, goodness, and beauty, which we believe have their highest expression and source in God. We consider them as precious allies in the commitment to defending human dignity and building peaceful coexistence between peoples and in protecting creation. This dialogue is for justice. It is for the common good. What we speak about today, what we share, and how we come together as people of faith and goodwill matters because it enables us to better serve one another, our nation, and our world. This idea of dialogue for the common good has a profound resonance with the animating spirit of our university as the oldest Catholic and Jesuit university in the United States. We're animated by an understanding that as human beings, we are born for the sake of each other. These are the words of Cicero. One of the foremost scholars on Jesuit history here at Georgetown, Professor John O'Malley, writes of the foundational influence of Cicero's De Officiis on St. Ignatius and on the first Jesuits. De Officiis is often translated as on public responsibility. Cicero was a favorite author. The early Jesuits knew his work by heart. And Father O'Malley identifies this passage of Cicero's as having a foundational resonance with our tradition. We are not born for ourselves alone. Everything the earth produces is made for our use, and we too, as human beings, are born for the sake of other human beings, that we might be able mutually to help each other. We ought therefore to contribute to the common good of humankind by reciprocal acts of human kindness by giving and receiving from one another, and thus by our skill, our industry, and our talents, work to bring human society together in peace and harmony. Our culture, our institutions, systems, structures, our policies for taking care of one another must reflect our most deeply held values, a respect for human dignity, a commitment that we will strive for conditions that enable each one of us to be our most authentic selves, capable of achieving our full promise and understanding that we truly are all in this together, that there is a good we can achieve together that we could never achieve alone. This is the animating spirit of this conference. This is the foundation of our dialogue. This is the work that we engage together today. We're grateful for your presence, for your participation in this important conversation. And it's now my pleasure to introduce to you the Archbishop of Washington, Cardinal Donald Wuerl. Cardinal Wuerl has been the Archbishop of Washington since 2006. He serves on numerous national and international bodies, including the Pontifical Council for Culture, which has brought us together today, as well as the Vatican congregations for the doctrine of faith, bishops, and the clergy, and the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity. He was elevated to the College of Cardinals in 2010 by Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. He was also appointed Relator General for the latest Vatican Synod of Bishops on the new evangelization for the transmission of the Christian faith in 2012. In his role on the College of Cardinals, he was a participant in the election of Pope Francis in 2013. And in December, he was selected by Pope Francis to serve on the Congregation for Bishops. He's widely respected for his efforts on behalf of Catholic education and for his catechetical and teaching ministry, the author of numerous articles and books, including the best-selling Catechisms, The Teaching of Christ and the Catholic Way. His recent books include Seek First the Kingdom, New Evangelization, Passing on the Catholic Faith Today, and The Light is On for You, which was just published in February of this year. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to introduce to you His Eminence, Cardinal Donald Wuerl.
Dr. DeGioia, thank you. Thank you for that very, very gracious welcome. It is truly a great pleasure for me to be here this morning and to greet all of you in this Courtyard of the Gentiles program that is, as we just heard, jointly sponsored by the Pontifical Council for Culture, Georgetown University, and the Archdiocese of Washington. And as we undertake now the beginning of this extraordinary venture, the first time that we've had a Courtyard of the Gentiles program on this side of the Atlantic, I'm delighted to recognize particularly the two co-sponsors, the Pontifical Council for Culture, represented here this morning by His Eminence Cardinal Gianfranco Ravasi, whom I will have a few words to say about when I introduce him in a moment. And I want to thank him for his presence, for coming the distance to recognize the importance of this meeting and what he brings to this whole event by his very presence. Thank you so very, very much, Your Eminence. A particular word of gratitude to Dr. John DeGioia, the president of Georgetown, because it's this university and the work that has gone on through the university that we're having this event at all. And so we're very grateful for your seeing that this is happening. In anticipation of this first gathering here of the Courtyard of the Gentiles, I called a couple of my rabbi friends because I wanted to make sure I knew what exactly was this primary analogate in what we're going to be doing and talking about today. And they pointed out to me that it's very important to recognize that The courtyard of the Gentiles is a different type of forum than what would be taking place in that ancient world, for example, at the Areopagus, or at any of the fora that were reflective of the Roman Forum, where people come, exchange ideas, sometimes for political purposes, sometimes for economic purposes. But what makes the courtyard of the Gentiles so unique is that it is precisely the courtyard of the temple. It is an invitation for dialogue with the whole wider community, sharing whatever view of life, reality, faith or non-faith, but within the perspective that the temple itself brings something to the discussion. Today, translating that primary analogy into our world, what we're saying is what characterizes this meeting, this courtyard of the Gentiles, is the understanding that all the voices that are going to be heard to address the common good, to address where we want to go as a people building a good and just society. But we recognize in the courtyard of the Gentiles that religious faith traditions have something to bring to that discussion. Hence, it's all the more fitting that this effort at our own courtyard, that this would take place here at Georgetown University as an institution of higher learning that has a heritage of Catholic and Jesuit tradition as the background for invitation to all these voices to be heard. And the uniqueness of the venture, what makes this different, what makes the courtyard different than any other forum, is that sponsoring it, co-sponsoring it with the university and welcoming all the voices that are going to be heard here today is the Pontifical Council for Culture, representing the Holy See, and the Archdiocese representing the local church. As you look at the program today, and all the things that are going to transpire today, and that began last evening and will continue on tomorrow morning, I think you'll see the challenging dimensions of this project. But we also have to recognize that all of those who came to the courtyard of the Gentiles, and all of those who come now to this modern manifestation of it, come not so much to arrive at declarations or conclusions or statements, but rather that we might be enriched by the very fact that we're all speaking together towards great themes such as the common good and a truly good and just society, and that what takes place here has to continue into the future. It's been described by Cardinal Ravasi as a first step in what would be a process of conversation that goes on. It is in the conviction that those who gather in the courtyard of the Gentiles on the following day do so, aware that in one way or another, they are affected by the impact of the temple itself and the wisdom and experience it brings, that this conversation is truly unique. And thus it's my pleasure now to introduce to you the president of the Pontifical Council for Clergy. His Eminence, Cardinal Gianfranco Ravasi, was ordained a priest for the Archdiocese of Milan in 1966. And he continued graduate work at the Pontifical Biblical Institute and taught biblical exegesis. And that accounts in no small part for a portion of the library he's written on scripture, on biblical exegesis. He served in a variety of capacities. In 1989, he was named the prefect of the Ambrosian Library of Milan, which is an extraordinarily important academic, intellectual role that gathered people regularly for this type of conversation. He He was a member of the Pontifical Biblical Commission until Pope Benedict XVI named him to head the Pontifical Council for Culture. We were named cardinals together, and we both had the great privilege of being at the conclave that elected our present Holy Father, Pope Francis. Cardinal Ravasi is the author of what can only be described as a vast literary output. It's in areas of biblical study, dialogue with science and the world of art and culture. And in Italy, he is a familiar voice and face because of the numerous and continuous publications in journals and newspapers, and his regular appearance for years on Channel 5, the television, national television channel, where his presence has been a voice of faith in an ongoing discussion of culture. And so, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants in this first United States courtyard of the Gentiles, I'm honored to present to you His Eminence Cardinal Gianfranco Ravasi.
His Eminence Cardinal Ravasi prefers to speak in his mother tongue, Italian, because he can express himself more freely there. And I'll humbly and modestly try to be his voice in English.
Sono particolarmente grato al Cardinale Wuerl, mio compagno di cardinalato, per questa introduzione così affettuosa e a tutte le autorità accademiche, a partire dal rettore di questa università, il professor Di Gioia.
I would like to, in the first place, thank His Eminence Cardinal Wuerl, who is my companion at the Cardinal's hat, as well as President Di Gioia and all his collaborators who are collaborating in this particular event here.
Sono particolarmente emozionato di essere nell'interno di una università così nobile, in uno spazio così solenne, con un pubblico così numeroso, ma devo anche confessare che mi sento in famiglia, perché io ho insegnato per 30 anni in università.
I'm becoming particularly emotional to find myself in such a noble hall, in this splendid place, and with an audience so numerous. But I must also say that with my long experience as a professor, I like to deal with this type of occasions.
Vorrei ora, prima di parlare proprio a questa università, e lo farò in finale, al rettore di questa università in maniera particolare, vorrei fare una piccola considerazione anch'io sul tema che verrà sviluppato in questa giornata.
Before I address the residents of this university, with the rector in particular, the president in particular, which I will do towards the end, I would like to begin with a consideration, with an observation on the theme of the event itself.
Io presenterò due figure che usano lo stesso simbolo. Sono due figure della cultura occidentale, distanti 3 secoli tra di loro.
I will try to use two different personalities, both coming from the Western culture, both of culture, and both which are at a distance of 2 centuries from each other.
La prima figura è un poeta elisabettiano molto celebre, inglese, John Donne, che ha una definizione celebre della persona umana.
The first is an English Elizabethan poet, John Donne, who has a celebrated or famous definition of culture.
L'uomo, ogni uomo, non è un'isola, è invece parte di un continente.
Every man is not an island, but starts from a continent.
Questa prima parte della definizione è diventato anche il titolo di un saggio di un autore americano spirituale molto celebre, Thomas Merton.
The beginning line has also become title of a very famous novel, very famous essay by an American, Thomas Merton.
Ogni uomo perciò non è isolato in se stesso, ma è una cellula di un corpo, parte di un continente.
Man, therefore, is not isolated in himself, but is a cell or a collection of bodies that starts or that takes off from a continent.
Per cui uno dei drammi fondamentali, e qualche volta nelle famiglie esiste questo dramma, è il dramma dell'autismo. Il bambino, il ragazzo che non riesce a rompere il suo cerchio chiuso.
Therefore, one of the most dramatic, or one of the biggest dramas that also happen in families is that of autism, or sort of being self, where a child is not able to break from the bonds of the family.
Ecco, l'appello allora di John Donne è appunto a collaborare tutti insieme a far parte di questo corpo che è l'umanità.
Therefore, John Donne's appeal to everyone is to become part of this body, which is humanity.
Nella tradizione giudaica rabbinica, abbiamo la presenza anche del mondo ebraico, nella tradizione rabbinica si dice che gli uomini creano le monete con un unico conio e fanno le monete tutte uguali.
There is a rabbinic, or in the rabbinic tradition, and we have rabbis present here, is that many coins are made with the same mint.
Mentre per quanto riguarda l'umanità, unico è il conio, siamo tutti uguali, ma siamo tutti diversi.
Therefore, as far as humanity is concerned, we all have the same mint, but like coins, we are all different.
Ecco perché il rapporto tra diversità e identità è fondamentale per il bene comune.
That is why the relationship between diversity and identity is essential and fundamental for the sake of common good.
Noi non siamo un'isola, ma un continente.
We are not
umano.
an island, but we are a continent.
Seconda immagine, sempre con l'immagine dell'isola, l'autore è Wittgenstein, Ludwig Wittgenstein, filosofo austriaco del secolo scorso.
The second symbolism, again, of an island is the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein,
il quale nella sua opera Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus diceva: ciò che io volevo definire erano i confini di un'isola.
He, in his famous book,
Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus.
Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, says
che ciò che lui voleva fare era delineare i contorni di un'isola.
what he wanted to do was to delineate the boundaries of an island.
Noi siamo finiti, siamo un'isola, la nostra pelle, il nostro corpo ci limita.
We are finite, our skin, our body limits us.
Continuava il filosofo, ciò che ho scoperto alla fine erano le frontiere dell'oceano.
What I discovered were the frontiers of an ocean.
Perché l'isola è piccola, chiusa in se stessa, ma è compressa e avvolta dall'oceano, dal mare.
Because the island is small, it is closed in itself, but it is surrounded and enclosed by the ocean.
E allora concludeva, sulla nostra pelle battono le onde dell'eterno e dell'infinito.
Therefore, he concluded that on our skin fall lavishly and heavily the waves of the infinite.
E questo dimostra che il bene comune contiene anche valori che sono valori trascendenti.
This implies that common good also includes values that are transcendental,
Infiniti come l'oceano,
infinite like the ocean.
misteriosi, segreti, che vengono chiamati religiosi dai credenti e vengono chiamati valori etici da chi non è credente.
Mysterious, secret, those are called religious by those who believe, and those are called values by those who do not believe.
Ecco perché tra questo limite e l'infinito, tra queste due dimensioni, è necessario che si costituisca nella società un duplice approccio.
Therefore, in this relationship between the finite and the limited and the ocean of the infinite, there is a need of constructing a relationship.
E qui si spiega alla fine il tema del rapporto Chiesa, Stato, fede, società.
That is why we need to define the relationship between church and state, between church and society, religion and faith.
And society. La frase di Cristo che voi tutti conoscete è emblematica, è una frase date a Cesare quel che è di Cesare e date a Dio quel che è di Dio.
That is why you have the symbolic phrase of Jesus, which says, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, give unto God what is God's.
Entrambi i campi sono indipendenti, ma non totalmente separati.
Both areas are independent, but not totally separate.
Questa frase di Cristo, che nel testo greco comprende soltanto 50 caratteri, meno di un tweet, quindi 50 caratteri, questa frase è ancora il tema fondamentale della discussione del rapporto tra Chiesa, Stato, società e religione.
This phrase, which in Greek has only 50 characters, which is very, very small, is still the fundamental principle.
Meno di un tweet.
Which is as good as a tweet, or rather, which is smaller than a tweet.
Not only
is
il riassunto
is the summary, the principle of what still happens to be the principle of discussion between the relationship between church, state and church, religion and society.
E certamente oggi nel dibattito queste due componenti del bene comune dovranno apparire.
And definitely in the debate that follows, the discussion that follows today, these two components of the debate will come into appearance.
Ecco, ora io concludo invece con un gesto rivolto alla università, un gesto personale che voglio rivolgere all'università.
His Eminence would like now to conclude with a gesture, a personal gesture towards the university that will be done now.
Vorrei ora consegnare al rettore dell'università la targa del Pontificio Consiglio della Cultura, la targa ufficiale, che comprende un'immagine di Michelangelo.
I would now like to gift to the President of the University the medal of the Pontifical Council of Culture, which is an image or a picture that is done by Michelangelo.
Si tratta della Sibilla delfica, la Sibilla della Sapienza, la cultura greca, la cultura cristiana unita.
It is the Delphic Sibyl, the Sibyl of Wisdom.
Che ha il libro e la fiamma che illumina, la luce che illumina la mente e il cuore.
It has the book and the flame that illuminates the heart and the mind.
E l'augurio che io rivolgo a tutta l'università lo esprimo e concludo con le parole di Platone nella sua apologia di Socrate.
And the greeting and the hope that I would like to express to the whole university, I would like to do it from the apology of Socrates.
Il che Platone mette in bocca al suo maestro Socrate questa frase sul tema fondamentale della vita umana, la ricerca.
Plato puts into the mouth of Socrates this particular phrase.
Una vita senza ricerca non merita di essere vissuta.
This is about research. And Plato says, putting it in the words of Socrates, a life without research is not worth living.
Grazie.
Can I just read that? I'll just read this. I'll just read the inscription that is written to the president, staff, and students of Georgetown University in appreciation of their collaboration with the Courtyard of the Gentiles.
Good morning.
So good morning again and welcome. My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm director of our Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and I am delighted to welcome you to this, our first panel on the topic, Realizing the Common Good. A conversation about what divides us, but also about how we can build common ground in our societies, nationally and internationally, and do so by drawing on our diverse cultural and religious traditions. Realizing the common good in the sense of imagination, imagining the common good, but also in the sense of action. How do we realize the common good in practice? And it's my pleasure to introduce the wonderful panel we've assembled for this discussion. From your right to left, we first have Father Brian Hare, who is the Parker Gilbert Montgomery Professor of the Practice of Religion and Public Life at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and a former president of Catholic Charities USA. Phil Zuckerman is Professor of Sociology at Pitzer College in Claremont, California, and an expert in the role of secularity and atheism in culture and society. Saba Mahmood is an Associate Professor of Sociocultural Anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley, and a leading scholar on the relationship between modern religion and secularism, with a special focus on Islam, gender, and non-Muslim minorities. We then will hear from Michael Gerson, who you all know as a nationally syndicated columnist in the Washington Post and nearly 100 other newspapers, and who now serves as a senior advisor at ONE, a bipartisan organization dedicated to the fight against extreme poverty and preventable diseases. Our moderator this morning, also known to everyone here, is Cokie Roberts, an award-winning journalist and author, a contributing senior news analyst for National Public Radio, and a regular roundtable analyst for This Week with George Stephanopoulos. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panel.
Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. I'm too much of a mother not to say this. There are plenty of seats up here for those of you who, and those have our names on them, and we're sitting up here. So please come take seats if you want to. Your Eminences, President DeGioia. It is such a treat to be here. I did not go to Georgetown. It was a boys' school when I was in college. I spent a summer here after I had flunked math, and it was really great being a girl at Georgetown then, because they didn't think we were smart. So I got A's. I mean, it was great. But my brother's son, nephew, brother-in-law, you know, everybody went to Georgetown, and my great-grandfather went to Georgetown, came here from Louisiana. His mother, we have a letter, his mother says, you're short, try to get half fare. And then he left to fight for the Confederacy in the Civil War. So it is a long tradition, and then of course I have that Jesuit uncle, but who was a character. So it is great to be here, and it is wonderful to celebrate the courtyard of the Gentiles. And when I looked it up in Herod's temple, it was the outermost court where everybody could come together, and then beyond that was the courtyard of the women, which amazed me. And then the men, and then the priest. So that part hasn't changed. But I was delighted to see that faith and morality and patriotism are female, along with art and science. So that's all good. But this is a great panel that we have here this morning, and they've already decided how they're going to go. We're going to hear a few thoughts from them. Then we'll have a conversation up here, and then we would love to hear your questions and take it from there. And then we will all go out to the courtyard. So we will start now. Michael, were you first up?
Sure. I'm happy to start in. It's a big topic, the common good. But let me start in a little bit of an odd place, just because I have some fresh impressions. I literally just got off a plane at 5 a.m. this morning from the Central African Republic.
Wow.
Which, and I hope the jet lag is not too obvious, but CAR is a country that has descended from political chaos into mass murder, where political leaders feed religious conflict, which have taken on a life of its own and resulted in murder and reprisal. And so you now have more than 2,000 dead, perhaps 20% of the population displaced, and Muslims now attacked and lynched just about every day. It is now religious leaders, when I was there, Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, are desperately trying to work together to prevent the society from being permanently broken. And all this is doubly frightening because it emerged in a very short amount of time in a country with a history of religious tolerance and even intermarriage between Christians and Muslims. I talked to one aid official when I was there who was evacuating the children of mixed marriages because they're targeted for murder. And at one level, sitting back as I was coming here and thinking about what I might add to this discussion as a non-academic, it was a reminder for me that America's divisions are now relatively modest. Modest compared to Rwanda and Burundi, where I had just been before, modest compared to our own history of civil war and Jim Crow. On another level, however, it was a vivid reminder for me that a working, tolerant society is not a natural state. It's a careful construction in every generation out of the material of sympathy and respect and a sense of shared common destiny. And given human nature, a working, tolerant society is more fragile than we sometimes assume. I'm not going to quote Cicero or Socrates or Wittgenstein, but T.S. Eliot said, if I'm remembering it correctly, it is hard for those who live near a police station to believe in the triumph of violence. But there are places where violence triumphs. There's something natural in favoring yourself, your family, your tribe, your religion, your group above others. And some of us call it original sin. It takes effort and education and sacrifice to seek the welfare of the whole, to make sure the vulnerable gain special protection, and to universalize the idea of human dignity. And it is the great contribution of the ideal of the common good in our common life to push back against some of the most natural destructive tendencies of human nature and human history. And the Catholic tradition has been one of the great teachers of the common good, including to non-Catholics like me. The common good, just to begin a discussion, is not identical to market forces, which can be dehumanizing in the absence of moral commitments. Common good is not identical to state action. It requires the health of communities and voluntary associations and families and religious institutions which the state should honor and strengthen and not undermine. And the common good is not identical to individual autonomy and choice, which sound like freedom, but can sometimes be a prison of excess or an excuse to exploit others. The common good is a set of social circumstances that allows everyone to flourish and be valued and have dignity. And though we will naturally have some disagreements on how to achieve it, it is the goal that makes a just and generous society possible.
Thank you. Saba.
Thank you. I want to thank for the invitation to participate in this conversation. It's really a pleasure to be here. I've been asked to put on my hat as the scholar of Islam and think about the place of Islam within our community here in the United States. And I want to start by saying that any discussion of Islam in America today must begin by reminding ourselves that Islam, like any other religious tradition, exhorts its followers to be capacious, engaged, respectful, and ethical with those it does not share its beliefs. It's important for us to remind ourselves of this precisely because there are Muslims who want to brush aside these aspects of the tradition and non-Muslims who want to characterize Islam as essentially and by nature intolerant. I just want to give you brief examples of some quotations from the Quran. So for example, in chapter 5, the Quran says, "To each of you we have given a law and a way and a pattern of life. If God had pleased, he could surely have made you one people professing one faith. But he wished to try and test you by that which he has given each of you. So try to excel in good deeds. To him will you all return in the end. It is he that will show you the truth of the matters in which you dispute." This is echoed again in chapter 49 in the Quran. "We created you all from a single man and a single woman and made you into races and tribes so that you should recognize one another." What's interesting is that these verses are the culmination of a surah in which the Torah is depicted as a vessel of God's guidance and light. And Muslims are told to let the people of the gospel judge by what God has sent down in it. And of course, there is the hadith, the saying of the Prophet, which says, disagreement within the community is a blessing. Now, of course, we know that these exhortations exist in scriptures, sayings and deeds of the Prophet, but there is also immense disagreement among Muslims as to how they should be interpreted and how they should be lived. And it is precisely because there is a debate and disagreement within the tradition that it provides a bridge to the debates that are shared across religious and secular traditions about what it means to be respectful of each other's beliefs and values. Now, in today's political climate, when disagreements between Muslims and non-Muslims erupt in Europe and in America, it is too common to not think of the shared heritage of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism as the resources through which we can think across these differences. Instead, both sides tend to paint these differences as absolute and insurmountable. And here I just want to remind ourselves of a recent controversy and take that as an example to think about what I mean when I say that there are resources within the tradition across religious and secular divides and across the monotheistic faiths. And it is the example of the Danish cartoons that were published in Europe, depicting the Prophet Muhammad in various sorts of ways that seems to have angered a number of Muslims, particularly in Europe and other parts of the Muslim world. Now, in this controversy, what happened was that one side basically characterized Islam as intolerant of criticism and humor, and said that the publication of these cartoons was necessary in order to protect freedom of speech. On the other hand, was the sense that Europeans are set upon insulting Islam among Muslims, and therefore to use freedom of religion clauses within Europe to basically argue that these cartoons should be banned. Very quickly, the standoff was basically set as a conflict between Islamic taboo and freedom of speech. And indeed, there was a great attempt on both parts from both sides of the divide to reach for the law to settle the conflict. And I think this is where a different kind of tradition have been prevailed upon, because what we had in the Danish cartoons was a depiction of Muhammad, but what was at stake was Muhammad, the persona of Muhammad himself, and his place within the Islamic tradition, which is akin in some ways to the place of Jesus in Christianity. Of course, Muhammad is a prophet and Jesus is the Son of God. There are fundamental differences, but what was at stake was the iconicity of Muhammad himself. And certainly, by all means, across the different traditions of monotheistic traditions, we can discuss what it means to think about iconicity of Muhammad and how to reach for an ethical dialogue of an ethical understanding that is rooted across these differences to think about how a contemporary culture of ethical self-understanding could be forged. This would require, of course, not simply saying that we are parallel and coexistent traditions, but it would require actually coming and sitting down around a table and thinking of the differences simultaneously as the traditions that unite us. So the tradition of Corpus Christi, for example, in which the persona of Jesus was simply considered to be symbolic, but a material inhabitation of the exemplarity and iconicity of Jesus that is important as an ethical resource for Christians, and how that has deep resonances with the way in which Muhammad is revered and thought through in the Islamic tradition. And then, of course, on the secular side, you have various ways in which let's say, the iconicity of even important figures such as Madonna, but many others, is thought through in our contemporary culture. In other words, there is a way in which the exemplarity of these individuals exceeds simply the reverence of the object itself and exceeds the personality of what is at stake there. And this is where I think Courtyard of the Gentiles perhaps provides one model where we can get together, come together, not because we want to say how law can actually allow freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and how this conflict should be settled in the courts, but in terms of forging an understanding together that makes it possible for us to live as communities. So I think that is what I would like us to see do in the next few hours. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Paul.
Thank you. The common good. I was there last night. I lived it. I smelled it. I tasted it. It was awesome. It was fantastic. It was a science fair at an elementary school in some place beyond Bethesda. It was real, very real, and I'm here to report on it. I arrived yesterday. I have an old friend that I met in college, Chaim Malka, who works here in DC, so I got here in the afternoon, and sometimes when you get to a new place after a 5-hour flight, you just want to sit in the bath and channel surf, but sometimes you want to like see somebody or do something, and it was such a beautiful afternoon, so I called him and I said, yeah, he was at work, and I said, yeah, I'm free, let's get together. So he said, okay, meet me at DuPont Circle at Kramer's bookstore, and I'd never been there, so I said, sounds good, and what a beautiful afternoon. So I got off, actually the cab dropped me off, and there was my good friend Chaim, gained a little weight, so have I. Hadn't seen him in a long time, both lost some hair. But it was good to see each other, and we had lunch there at the bookstore, and it felt so wonderful. But then he said, you know, we're in our 40s. He's like, you know, my kid's got a science fair. Do you want to come home and go to the science? Let's go to the science fair. So we got on the metro and we went out, Grosvenor, I don't know what it's called. And I couldn't pronounce it. And we walked from there to his house, and there were his kids. One's in 6th grade, one's in 3rd grade, and one of them played saxophone for me. It was fantastic. And then his wife came home from work, and it was 6:45, and we walked through some woods to an elementary school, public school, to a science fair. And I couldn't have been happier. There we were, and he kept saying to me, oh, it's nice of you to come along. I said, what? I've got kids. What do you think? I want to go out to I'm not 20 anymore, so let's enjoy the science fair. And there it was, and it was cardboards and presentations on food dye, and people were giving out Mentos and stuff on earthquakes, volcanoes, how mountains are formed, and Chaim's son did a thing on paper, how paper is made, and he made his own paper at home, and he showed the process, and you could take samples of the paper. Science fair, 3rd grade, public school. What did I see there? I saw a diversity of human beings. I saw various faith traditions, at least from visible signs. I saw people wearing yarmulkes. I saw people in headscarves. I saw people with crucifixes on their neck. And of course, people with none of these obvious symbols at all. So who knows where they are spiritually or religiously. But I could see a diversity of faith traditions in this school. I could see a diversity of racial and ethnic groups, people from different places, different skin colors, different phenotypes, and obviously, perhaps there could have been more diversity. I think white people often overestimate diversity, and maybe I fell victim to that too. Noticed a lot of different languages being spoken all over. I heard Arabic, I heard what seemed like Russian, I heard what sounded like Spanish, Asian languages. And there we all were, but it was secular space. And by that I mean this was a public school funded by tax dollars, a government-established institution. And no religion was privileged. There was no crucifix on any wall. There was no statue of the 10 Commandments anywhere, no images of Islam or Judaism. Those were left, they were absent from this institution. And I thought to myself, yay, the First Amendment is alive and well. I feel like this is how it should be for the common good. There are my friend drove me home that night from Grosvenor to Georgetown. We passed mosques, we passed synagogues, we passed all kinds of churches. Wonderful. But government should clearly, as our founding fathers were so brilliant in understanding, should not be in the business of repressing religion in any sense or limiting the free exercise thereof, nor should it be in the business of supporting or establishing religion. And so I saw my old friend's 3rd grade science fair as the epitome of that vision, of a secular space where we can come together. It's a public space, it's a government institution, and it does not privilege any religion. That's not its business. And I thought it was fantastic. And I think it's more important now than ever. Well, maybe that's not true, actually. But there is a change. There is a change. I was so impressed to hear one of the cardinals speak of faith and non-faith. This is new. This is new. We're hearing this for the first time. When President Obama was inaugurated in 2008, and mentioned that we are a nation of Christians and Muslims and Jews and Buddhists and non-believers. That was new. We never heard a president say that before, let alone at an inauguration. And even the fact that I was invited here, that the secular population is asked to partake, is really fantastic. And I think it's really wonderful. And the statistics, I don't want to bore you, but I have to get this in here. You know, back in the 1950s, maybe about 4% of Americans said they had no religion. By the 1970s, 80s, crept up to 6, 7%. By the 90s, it was maybe at 8% of Americans saying they had no religion. By 2001, it was at 14%, and that was front page news on USA Today. Now we are seeing it at 18, 19, the latest at 20% of Americans saying they have no religion. And among Americans that are under 30, so between 18 and 29, it's at 33%, a third of that demographic saying they have no religion. So clearly, the secular population is growing. Our politicians are taking note, our academics are taking note, and it's wonderful to see that people of faith are taking note as well, and that we are being invited to the table. But even if the population of non-religious Americans was at 0, the First Amendment is still brilliant, it's still the bedrock. And that, to me, is a fundamental pillar of the common good, that government shall not be in the business of repressing or suppressing religion, nor shall it be in the business of establishing or supporting it. And I hope, on that point, I will not compromise. Thank you.
Okay.
When
Right.
someone hands you the modest topic of faith, culture, and the common good and says between 4 and 5 minutes at the outside, my years of experience on platforms like this says reduce it to 3 points and get off the stage. So my first point is, of course, the common good is about both individual societies like the United States or England or the Central African Republic, and it is global. John the 23rd, 51 years ago this month, said the common good is about nations and about the globe as a whole. With that as a background, let me say a word about structure, substance, and specifics regarding the common good. On the structural question, what is fundamental, I think, is the right to religious freedom. The need to protect that domestically and globally is of preeminent concern at the present time. Now, protecting the right to religious freedom is two-dimensional. You have to get the constitutional specifics right, and that is in itself a major task, because you can protect the right, but you have to do it within different cultures. And so the constitutional provision, while the substance is similar throughout the world, not every constitution will simply replicate the First Amendment. The second part is cultural. You can have the right constitutional dimension, and if you don't have a tolerant culture, if you don't fabricate a tolerant culture with a certain vision, as some of my colleagues have indicated, then the constitutional order will be in danger. So protecting the right to religious freedom is to protect the sacredness of human conscience. It's also to provide for safety within a mixed society. People protected by that right will feel safe, and therefore it is the first great good of the common good. Secondly, the substance of the common good, the idea itself. It is not strange to have the common good talked about at Georgetown. But I must confess, in American culture, with our highly individualistic incentives about the way we think of citizenship, the notion of common good for a long time was not a commonly used phrase. The first American politician I can remember who referred to the common good was Barbara Jordan when she addressed the Democratic National Convention, when she had first been elected to the Congress. Because the notion of the common good relates directly to two aspects of humanity. We are all sacred and we are all social. Or to put it another way, it is about the dignity of the person and the social nature of the person. The social nature of the person means that we need a context to grow and develop as fully human beings. And that really is what the common good is about. It is about a society that recognizes, in the words of Pope Francis in his exhortation, that the whole is greater than the parts. And what that means is not to subordinate the individual, but it is that a society has to produce a mix of goods, temporal, spiritual, religious, secular goods that everyone can draw from, and that we are not islands, if you will, but we are bound together by bonds of humanity that require a series of goods if all are to flourish. The common good also, finally, is in substance about remembering the edge of life. This is what Francis is talking about, that we think about those at the edge of life as we think about the common good of all. In the Catholic tradition, it is now about balancing the common good, the good of all, and the option for the poor, the need to weigh those at the edge. So that brings us to the specifics. I think what Francis is talking about, the Holy Father, is teaching us to begin at the edge of the circle as we think about the good of all. To begin at the edge of the circle and not to forget the rest. The common good is about the good of everyone. But the question is how you see the good we are pursuing and how you weigh different ways of achieving that good. Thinking about things at the edge and then coming into the center. Thinking about the macroeconomic policies needed to provide for the good of all, but remembering the specific things like food stamps and minimum wage and things like that, and immigration. That's about beginning at the edge and then coming to the center. The common good's about the center and the edge, and achieving a vision that satisfies both is, I think, what we're about in thinking about the common good today.
All right. Well, with those wonderful thoughts to lead us off, actually, Father Hare, let me pick up where you just left off, because among your many hats, you also run social services and healthcare for the Archdiocese of Boston. And you see people at the edge all the time. And one of the things that I find sort of relevant to this discussion is that, as Paul Zuckerman was saying, the people who say that they don't say they're not believers. They say they're not affiliated with a religion. You're quoting the Pew studies, and they say non-affiliated. 70% of them say they believe in God. 25% say they pray daily. All of that. So it is not that they don't believe; they just don't like organized religion, and they tend to be much more ready to help people on the edge than people who are identified with a religion. How do you square that?
Well, I actually think I'm fairly optimistic about both secular and sacred on this, believer and non-believer, because, of course, the right to religious liberty includes the right to protect the non-believer. John Courtney Murray used to tell us that, even as he wrote about religious freedom. But I think that actually focusing on the edge and bringing it into the civil society is easier today than bringing it into our political culture. My own experience in dealing with and asking for assistance for people at the edge, let me give you a cameo. The thing we need to remember is that the economy in this country has started to grow, but the outcome and the consequences of the last 5 years will not be easily overcome. In one food pantry that our Catholic Charities supports in Boston, in 2007, we used to give out 5,000 pounds of food a month. We now give out 45,000 foods a month, 45,000 pounds of food every month. And it is the third week of the year, the third week of the month that people come in, because that's when they're balancing heat and food. That's when they're balancing medical care and food. So when you put that before people, I think on the whole, you get a response from both secular and sacred, if you will. When you transfer it into the political discourse of the country, then you end up cutting food stamps by 75% in the Farm Bill. And so the gap I see is not between believer and unbeliever. The gap I see is the public, general, civil society approach to these questions and our inability to translate it into the political realm in an effective way to deal with those at the edge. It the bigger gap, I think. It's not belief and unbelief.
Michael, you've written about these questions. You would think that a commitment to the common good that is explicitly stated in these religious traditions would then lead people to support things that would lead, one would think, to the common good. And yet that doesn't seem to be as much the case as it is for people who don't subscribe.
Yeah. Well, I think that's just some of this is a reflection of a broader political culture that has become more polarized over time. Our parties have been ideologically sorted so that you don't have the same diversity within the parties. You have very much a liberal party and a conservative party. And you have arguments about the role of government dominating our political discourse. And sometimes it's a very uncreative argument between equality and liberty and seems unreconcilable. And the goal of creative political leadership is to try to talk about things like opportunity, mobility, building social capital, practical reforms to increase people's skills in a modern economy. I think specificity is important to this argument rather than broader ideological argument. It benefits from that type of reform agenda. But let me just give you one example, though, that illustrates for me some of the hope, okay? Because I did spend some time in government at a time of intense polarization. I worked in the Bush administration. But when George W. Bush went to the US Congress and proposed the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, the largest proposal to fight a single disease in human history, to respond particularly to the African AIDS crisis, the main supporters that we had in the Congress were Joe Biden and John Kerry. The President proposed this. It was passed within 3 months with bipartisan support. Because of this and the Global Fund and the contributions of countries themselves, we have over 5 million people on AIDS treatment in Africa. I get depressed about politics often because of what I have to do twice a week and write about division. But then there are some of these examples, and I would add there that was a coalition, not just between the parties, but also traditionally more liberal human rights and global health groups and religious groups, evangelical and Catholic voices that came together in an extraordinary coalition on an issue like that. Now, I wish we could do that on more issues, but at least I think we ought to admit that we've seen glimmers of this possibility
and
of
huge life-saving glimmers.
Right,
I mean,
yeah,
we've saved
exactly.
millions and millions of
right,
lives.
so more than glimmers.
Yeah. Paul, you want to address this question?
First of all, it's Phil. Sorry,
I'm
Koki.
sorry.
That's all right. I get that all the time. I don't mind.
That's a biggie.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure I understood what you were saying. It sounded as though you were saying that secular people maybe do more in terms of, and I'm not so sure that's true. I'm not sure what you're referring to. My understanding of the data is that religiously active people and self-identified religious people are far more likely to give to charity, far more likely to be involved in community groups, have more social capital. Secular people tend to be much more individualistic and less likely to do that. So I'm not quite sure.
But when asked about questions like, support for food stamps, for instance.
You bet. Okay, absolutely. So first also I would, I have to say, the American Religious Identification Survey found different percentages on belief than those you cited. The data I'm familiar with shows about half of those who say they're non-religious are agnostic or atheistic in orientation. They don't like to use those words, especially atheist, it's so stigmatized. But absolutely, as far as I see the data on issues of social justice, secular people or non-religious people or people who don't identify as being religiously involved are far more likely to support government expenditures towards for healthcare, for fighting poverty. And in fact, if we look at those societies in the world today that have the lowest rates of poverty in the world, and not just the lowest rates of poverty, but the smallest gap between rich and poor. So even very wealthy societies, yet the gap between rich and poor is the smallest. These are the nations of Scandinavia, which are the most secular societies that perhaps the world has ever known, at least in terms of standard measurements of church attendance, faith in God, belief in life after death, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a correlation, just a correlation, between globally in terms of a strong welfare state and limited religious involvement and identification, but even here in the United States. And I have to point out one, speaking of Central African Republic, I couldn't help think of this, but if you look at the data on who's most likely to own guns, support gun ownership, support the proliferation of guns and semi-automatic weapons. And so not only who owns the guns, but who has more guns, who supports freer access to guns. It's a direct correlation. The strongly evangelical Christians are the most likely to own guns, have guns, love guns, and you can go all the way down to secular Americans who are the least likely to own guns and want to have guns. So I do believe
some of that's regional.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I was recently in Montana, absolutely. So there's something to be said about who is more supportive of these kind of social programs, for sure.
Sam?
Yeah, I think I actually find this interesting. You know, all religious traditions have the kind of commitment to charity and welfare.
Right.
And of course, you know, the Archdiocese has done a tremendous amount, not only in this country, but around the world. What I find very deeply troubling in this moment, and I say this as a person who's been working on issues in the Middle East, particularly Christian-Muslim conflict, and also in South Asia, what I find very disturbing is that as the various states and various parts of the world have become privatized, and by which I mean that as the state commitment has declined to the provision of social services, it is religious institutions that have stepped up to provide what the states now do not provide. So as a result, the rise of Islamic charities, Christian charities, and institutions has been just exponential all over the Middle East, but also in, for example, Pakistan, in India, and Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. Now, on the one hand, this is, of course, commendable, but on the other hand, it is creating a huge problem, because what it really does is it eviscerates the possibility of coming together as citizens within these countries. And in fact, sectarian conflicts, religious identity becomes your primary avenue through which you actually begin to approach your membership in the polity. And sectarian conflicts then can really take off, because if your religious identity is the primary identity through which you actually identify with the society and the polity in general, then there is a very thin line from that to saying that I am really only responsible to my religious sect, and not what it means to come together as a nation. And so you see this, for example, in Egypt, a country where I have worked for the last 20 years. And there has been a proliferation of Christian charities as well as Muslim charities. And of course, they're immensely important in the moment when the state has basically taken away subsidies. And of course, the privatization of the state is directly linked to the kind of policies that the World Bank and IMF and USAID push. So there is this is what we mean when we say neoliberalization of the state, and we see that happening in this country as well, where increasingly fewer resources are being committed for the provision and taking care of the poor of this country. So increasingly, the Archdiocese and other such charities are, of course, stepping in. These are private charities. So I think it's immensely important, as we actually think about the role of religious charities and what the harm they can do in the absence of an equal commitment on the part of the state to take care of the poor, of the disenfranchised, and those who do not have the resources to be able to go on the market in particularly volatile conditions, economic conditions of the kind that we are facing in the world around right now. Otherwise, I do firmly believe that what you will see is people increasingly turning to their religious institutions in order to survive, and therefore actually not being able to come together and think across those differences. And you have this data from from the Middle East and South Asia, and I think we should pay attention to that in terms of what's happening in this country.
Very, very interesting point. And of course, in the absence of those religious charities building up, then you're talking about poverty and life-threatening situations. And that's exactly what you were talking about in the CAR, Michael. I mean, there it's the right to life, but it is really the dissolution of the tolerance that is necessary. And
well, in those extreme cases, you're absolutely right. You know, a vacuum of sovereignty is a terrible place to live. State institutions are essential, and that's CAR, it's Eastern Congo, these are the most extreme examples of the need to have protection and a sense of common destiny and public institutions that work. That is the kind of substructure. I would only add, though, that many of the religious institutions that provide charitable work that I've seen on the ground are providing benefits for non-members.
Right. Right.
So in the United States, if you look at Catholic schools in many places.
There's not a Catholic in them.
Right, it is. I mean, these were institutions that are often built for Catholic immigrant groups in the United States and have transitioned to completely serve non-members. I think that it's one of the great contributions of the church in a poverty context. So it can go both ways. It's not a source of identity. It's one of the confusion in our debate over the regulation of Catholic institutions in some recent debates is the assumption that they're serving Catholics, okay? When in fact that's often not the case.
We're going to set up a microphone in the middle of the aisle and start to take your questions. But that's a very good point. As the bishop said, we don't do this because they're Catholic. We do it because we're Catholic, and that is a very important thing to keep in mind. But does that disturb you, Phil?
Does what disturb me?
But that these religious institutions are taking over these roles.
Yes and no. I think anybody that's helping others is a good thing. Anybody that's alleviating poverty, fostering education, distributing health care, I mean, those are good things. And as long as one person is getting the help they need from whatever source, that's grand as far as I'm concerned. But I think I would echo that. But in my ideal situation, no one would lack for food, housing, jobs, or healthcare, and those things would be provided by the state. In a democratic state, I don't mean by Stalin, I mean in a democratic situation that is not anchored to a religious tradition. But I would like to see those things. I mean, that's not to say that religious traditions shouldn't be doing these things, absolutely, but I would like to see the need for those services to go down through progressive taxation.
I think there's also a danger of counterpointing the secular and the sacred here. It's better to find where the concept of the common ground, the common good, is not literally found in the scriptures. The ideas may be behind it, but it's an idea that you can appeal to on a basis of faith or no faith. It is a conceptual. And when you think of these religious institutions, they're going to do what they're going to do because of what they are. But there's no imaginary scene where they can do what needs to be done. So to think about them is to think about them in a subsidiary and complementary role, and to think about them without the larger public policy framework they need is to simply undercut their work as well as to forsake the work that the state ought to fulfill in any good society according to the common good.
You can't do it all. It's just too much to do. All right. If you would please state your name, and if there's an affiliation, do that as well.
Gary Maring. I am on the board of N Street Village for homeless program for homeless women. I would very complimentary to this panel. It's a great topic and a great panel. Let me go to the federal budget, and Paul Ryan, who's a prominent Catholic who has appeared here at Catholic University in 2012. I commend the scholars at Catholic University for challenging Paul Ryan when he appeared on his misinterpretation of social Catholic teaching. My concern is that he's also appearing at Catholic University and other Catholic universities for fundraising, and I don't see the same challenge to his misinterpretation of Catholic social.
Okay, can we get a question?
Yeah. So the question is to the Georgetown and the Catholic scholars here. What is the role of the Church in challenging political authority, particularly when one of yours, a Catholic, is posturing the most devastating budgets to the social safety net programs?
Well, I'm not sure any one of us is in a position. I'll throw that one to you, Brian. You used to teach here. You've got a collar on.
Well, the social tradition of Catholicism is a social tradition. It is made up of a series of ideas and principles by which we try to project a conception of what a good and just society is. The Catholic Church, I think defined by one author in one of his novels is, here comes everybody. And therefore, how the tradition fits a complex community is an ongoing question. What should the church do about political figures? My own sense is the church ought to speak about principles, it ought to speak about policies, it ought to seldom directly engage individual politicians, because if you look at the range of Catholic teaching, we could engage the U.S. Congress person by person if you ask about the whole tradition. I worked for 20 years in this town, and I did a lot of testifying on the Hill. And if you went up on Monday and testified on certain issues, you got half the committee. And if you came back on Wednesday on another issue, you got the other half. I then concluded that we have a lot of friends and no permanent allies. And I think it is that fact. So in the extreme case, would you take an individual on? Maybe, in the extreme case. Is it helpful to take individuals on one by one? I think in the long run, no. Is it useful to keep talking about your principles, your ideas, and what policies you support in advocacy? I think we ought to do it and let the cards fall where they may. People will know who we mean and who we don't when they look at the votes and the policies we advocate.
Do you think it was right that Georgetown University issued the letter?
There's a line behind you, okay? Thank you. My father used to always say, no permanent friends, no permanent enemies.
Yes, I'm Kyle Poole, founder of the 9/11 Unity Walk here in Washington that brings people of all different faiths together on Embassy Row. And my question is about service and charity. We now, let's see some speakers, Cardinal Wuerl. We now have charity as a major component, and you were mentioning bringing people of faith together. How common is it for charity of people of all different faiths? Again, that's a major part of our. And I must say, at the nuncio last year, we had 1,000 people coming at the papal nuncio to make trail mix for the poor. But I want to.
The Italians must have thought that was very odd food.
They loved it.
Does anybody want to take this question of Salva? Why don't you talk about this, because you've talked about the difficulties of that. Do you see places where there are advantages of where religions do come together in these situations?
Well, I think when different religious institutions that provide charities and welfare to the larger population, when they come together, I think that it has to be at the behest of a certain commitment to the larger common good, if you will, or a larger polity of which you really feel responsible in upholding and tending to the membership. And I think I absolutely agree with Mike that, of course, these charities provide services across denominations, across lines of religious difference. I think what ends up happening is that in the absence of a robust commitment on the part of the state to really take care in secular terms of its citizens, what you have is then an evacuation of that public role. Now, of course, it can degenerate into what Mike is suggesting, which is, the collapse of sovereignty per se, which is a very, dramatic and exaggerated form of failure of the state. But I think there are various forms of that. And what I see in America today is this real shift on the part of the state to privatize what used to be a commitment to provision of social and welfare services. And I think if we pass that buck on to religious charities, I think that is a step. It is a long step from the collapse of sovereignty, certainly, but it does take away the capacity for us to come together regardless of our religious differences. And, I happen to live in Berkeley, California, which has the worst public school systems from K through 12 after we passed Proposition 13, which eviscerated the taxation base for the public school system. My son happens to go to a private school, and I can see the difference in how he's being raised. The very limited exposure he has to a diversity of issues that I think he should be exposed to as a kid, and I will make sure that he goes to public high school and public university, because I do think that's the place where we actually begin to see what it means to share things, regardless of where we are coming from, what our personal resources are.
And you see people of different faiths coming together for charity?
Absolutely.
I mean,
absolutely. I see that all over the Middle East. I see that in South Asia, even where sectarian conflicts are really significant. Interreligious differences are very significant, very volatile. They do come together. However, it does not help if there is not an umbrella that cuts across those differences and says, okay, we are the state, we're going to make you actually come together in these institutions, in these places.
Okay, thanks. I would just add, one example I've seen is in Nigeria, where the tensions between Muslim and Christian are serious. Oh, wow. But you had the Sultan of Sodoko and the Catholic Archbishop came together on the nationwide malaria effort. I met with both of them, and they have kind of a show where they go around and talk about malaria awareness. And there was a lesson in there that sometimes if you were to do interfaith dialogue in Nigeria, it would not get you very far. If you work on protecting children from malaria, you can get a long ways, okay? And that idea can be applied in America in a certain way. It's one reason I like the idea of public service, of volunteerism in America, particularly in programs like AmeriCorps and other things, is when you have people from different backgrounds working on common problems, it builds ties. That's true in a religious setting, and it's true in a much broader social setting. At any rate, sometimes there's limits of just sitting down and talking through issues. But when you act together, it can really bridge gaps.
It's also true that we have a good bit of data that shows that people who do that, who get involved in volunteerism, then become much more civic-minded and get much more involved politically and in the polity. Anybody want to add to that? Okay. Here's the next question. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Kieran Halloran. I'm a senior here at Georgetown.
Great.
And I'm wondering...
Are you supposed to be in class right now? This is a class.
Michael Gerson, you mentioned earlier about the example of PEPFAR, where people of many different backgrounds got together to support this one issue for the common good. And you also just mentioned the example of Nigeria. And I'm wondering, how do you move beyond these almost one-off gatherings or issues to sort of create a broader culture that draws people together to promote the common good?
Well, that for me, particularly in the American political context, raises the whole issue of compromise in the common good. When I've seen progress on large issues that are not as discrete as the one that you're talking about, it's people that are willing to make incremental progress along with people of other ideological perspective on large problems. That's true of entitlement reform, which has to happen, or education reform, or higher education, or a variety of other issues. And we've had a bit of a breakdown in the whole idea of compromise in the American context. For me, I sometimes find myself critical of people that call themselves constitutional conservatives who don't seem to realize that the whole Constitution was a compromise process. It was created by a process of compromise.
There hasn't been a lot of reading of it.
Right, yeah. But so I would love to see on a broader set of those issues. The problem right now is we have a fairly dysfunctional political structure, and we have large public issues that become more urgent with time. fiscal imbalance and educational failure and lack of economic growth and very, very large problems, international competitiveness, that people, because of a political failure, are not addressing in a timely way, and then they get harder to address over time. I mean, we said that in a variety of areas. I find on Capitol Hill that you can often find under the radar significant progress on discrete issues. I was just with Congresswoman Bass from California, and she's working on issues that relate to human trafficking and the foster care system in America, where we have trafficking in the context of foster care. And she has Republican partners on Capitol Hill. They're likely to be able to accomplish something on that. But then you get to the budget, and it becomes almost impossible.
And it's a good time to remember this is the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. If you talk about religious groups coming together, that was clearly probably the most single effective engagement. I think Everett Dirksen argued that without those damn ministers, we wouldn't have had to deal with this bill. But of course, the churches and the religions had to come first with confession, because we had been part of the slavery question in different ways. So you confess first, and then you find a way to advocate. And that was a good example. The question is, for example, today, could you find that kind of consensual basis on immigration? An example that is common good example, because it has legitimate concerns of the state and safety of borders, legitimate concerns of what constitutes a just immigration policy, and burning concerns of how you settle the question of the undocumented, which is just not able to be settled by sending people home. So the question is how you put those three different, distinct concerns together in a comprehensive policy. If the religious community and the secular community could find a way to do that, it would be comparable, I think, to what the civil rights victory was in 1964.
Well, it's possible that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 will solve the problem of immigration because voters will speak. And anybody else want to contribute to this question before we get to the next one? Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, good morning. My name is Amr Hussain. I recently graduated from Georgetown, and I'll be attending med school next year at University of Chicago. My question is, I guess, mostly for Mr. Gerson, but anybody can answer. I'm doing a lot of reading on the Affordable Care Act and expanding access to healthcare. I was wondering if you have an opinion on how faith organizations should be involved with this. Like, I've met Sister Carolyn Keehan from Catholic Health, and I think that's a great example of an organization that brings people together for the common good. I was wondering if you had other suggestions on how we could do that.
Well, and Brian, why don't you address this, because you're dealing with it there and as head of health services.
Yeah. I think you would.
I missed the question. I'm sorry. I didn't.
So the question was the Affordable Care Act and how religious institutions should be dealing with it. Is that what you're asking?
Mostly, yeah. How do you think faith organizations should be involved in expanding access to healthcare?
My immediate response is that faith organizations are involved in expanding access to health care
all the time
and have been for 100 years in most cities in America. I would just say, whenever I go to Africa, in many parts of Africa, well over half, sometimes much more than half of all health care is provided through faith organizations. And it's a common thing that organizations have been led to. It's difficult with the Affordable Care Act. There have clearly been, questions of exactly the type we're talking about, of assuring access to things that are regarded as fundamental health services and how it relates to the freedom of religious institutions. And churches have spoken out on this. My general approach there is that America is that these rights that we talk about, First Amendment rights, do not just adhere to individuals. They actually adhere to institutions that where their work is undermined if they cannot maintain their own standards and integrity in the way that they approach these type of issues. but it's a serious balance that's been a huge argument. And of course, I think religious people hold a variety of views on whether the Affordable Care Act itself is good public policy or could be, changed in some important ways. But I think generally, I got in trouble for this just this week, okay, for saying that and I think it's related to this notion of the common good, that some element of basic health coverage is a right, okay? And I think religious people often bring that perspective. But I would only say that that does not determine then all these elements of prudence and good policy about the way that you take markets seriously, the way that you provide care. Those matters, are not matters of doctrine. They're matters of practice and prudence and wisdom and understanding the way human beings work in markets. And that's why we need both those elements, I think. We need people to call attention to the fact that there is a right here that we need to respect. And then we need serious laymen who know how to make systems work, okay? Which I think you're probably in that category.
It also, relating to the common good, at least as I understand the Catholic tradition, we have this huge discussion about inequality in the country today on various levels. And that is part of the Catholic tradition. But the first point in the Catholic tradition is not absolute equality, or it is that there ought to be a floor beneath which people do not fall on basic human goods. That's the first thing. There ought to be a floor on a few fundamental things: housing, nutrition, healthcare, education, access to employment, beneath which the floor people should not fall because their dignity is seriously threatened if it falls. The inequality questions in the macro sense are a second order consideration and a real consideration. But the healthcare question is, we have had a long battle to get admission that healthcare is a right. My understanding is the first 5 attempts at systematic healthcare, from Roosevelt through Clinton, couldn't get agreement that healthcare is a right. It was treated as a need. Right. You had a need, and hopefully enough different sources, secular and sacred, would fill the need. But a right, that is to say, if it is not fulfilled, it's an indictment of the fundamental structure of the society. That was not accepted, I think, until this most recent debate, the concept of the right. It was always treated as a need, at least as I read the data.
So the first Catholics in America who established that floor were the Ursulines in New Orleans in 1727, when they were sent to open military hospitals and ended up taking care of the poor, the free blacks in 1727, and Native Americans. So they immediately started in that tradition. Sabi, you wanted to say something?
I just want to add, I agree with everything that's been said, but I think one of the very biggest challenges that we are facing right now is the privatization of public goods. I think that's a very serious issue that we're facing in America. We see that in terms of, the privatization, the calls for privatization of Social Security, of Medicare, Medi-Cal. But the place where we are seeing this the most is in the privatization of public education. And I speak here, of course, as an employee of University of California, Berkeley, one of the largest universities of one of the best systems of public education that was established in California, and how it's being eviscerated. Remember that California provided public education at costs that allowed for Californians and others to get higher education without having to belong to a certain class. This is no longer possible. The tuition, out-of-state tuition in California, is the same as any private university in the country. And we have seen the hike in the last, very short period of time, in the last 8 to 10 years. And so I see that in my classrooms. I see that in the change of the demographics and the students that I teach. And that is an immense loss That is a loss that we are not going to be able to recuperate, and we are going to not, once you privatize an entire public structure that was built with public funding, with tax dollars, and turn it over into a private good, we have just simply lost decades and decades of an institutional wealth that will no longer serve who it was created to serve. So I think the argument for privatization of public goods that you're already seeing, that has already really done huge damage, you can see that in the public education sector. And what I really fear is that it is moving into other parts, other avenues of our society, other public institutions. And I think that is a serious challenge. If we don't wake up to that, I think we've lost the battle.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Salam Al-Mariati. I'm with the Muslim Public Affairs Council. I want to take this into a different direction involving religion. The threat to religion is not secularism. Really, the threat to religion is religious nationalism. Religious nationalism has disfigured religion and has lent itself to extremist voices and actors that leads to atrocities against religious minorities or just other religious groups, whether in the Central African Republic or in Pakistan or in Saudi Arabia or in Bosnia. And so the question to us is, what's the narrative that we need as people of different religions or of no religion in dealing with this problem of religious nationalism? It actually surfaced, it flared up after 9/11 because you had religious nationalists who used hatred to attack our country. And then the counter narrative has been, well, we are at war against Islam. We, in our own religious nationalism, we call it the West. It really is translated by Muslims as Judeo-Christian religion. The Judeo-Christian religion is against the Islamic religion. And unfortunately, I think that narrative is playing out more than the narrative that I believe we're trying to develop in terms of let's work on behalf of religion for the common good. So how do we as Americans get a hold of that counter narrative and develop that religious ethics narrative in terms of religion in bringing religions together to counter religious nationalism from both sides?
Phil, do you want?
Well, which woman behind me is holding a sword? I think these images are pretty significant. Patriotism has the weapon of killing. Nationalism is a problem, always. Extreme nationalism, right? Any extreme. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say something that may offend everybody, but what the heck? We could use a little... sorry if I offend you. I believe that we have to be more cosmopolitan. We're all humans on this planet. And I believe that countries divide us. They separate us. So nationalism is an enemy to unity of humanity. I also believe that while religious traditions do a tremendous amount of good, and I don't want to see them go away, my view of religions is they also separate humanity. Jews and non-Jews, Christians and non-Christians, Muslims and non-Muslims, Buddhists and non-Buddhists. It's a division, but we're all human. So I'm going to wave my flag for secularism in here and say, humanism, there's no division. We're all human. We're not all Christian. We're not all Buddhist. We're not all Muslim. We're not all Jewish. We're not all Hindu. We're not all Pakistani or Armenian or Canadian, but we're all human. And I think any orientation that can emphasize the unity of humanity is really where it's at. So I know that's pretty abstract and ideological, but that's where I...
Well, I just want to build on that. See, I believe that religion actually is, the verse that Professor Mahmoud was reciting earlier about when God is quoted in the Quran that we have made you into different religions and ways. If it were God's will, he would have made you one community, but just he gives you different circumstances. I think what it's telling us is that to be religious, we have to first become human beings. And as the Reverend Father mentioned also, is that it is the sacredness of human beingness that you have to follow within religion. So my question is more towards the religious groups. How can we take that narrative in countering religious extremism?
Well, I think that's really that's the bull we have to take by the horn, right? And that's exactly the question. And what I find so remarkable is that whenever what you are calling religious nationalism, I call it religious bigotry, when it happens across contexts, across borders, how similar it is. Whether it is happening in the United States, whether it is happening in Europe, whether it's happening in Africa, whether it's happening in the Middle East, where there is a way in which the demonization of the other, right? It's a zero-sum game. If you survive, I don't survive. My survival is actually your extinction. And we see that not just simply in religious traditions, of course. We have the example of the Holocaust, which was not a religious ideology, it was a secular ideology. We see that in the Soviet Union. We see that the kind of demonization of the other, it can actually cut across religious and secular divides. So I think that's where I find that the resources for thinking about it have to be collective. They can't just be thought through in terms of religion, because let's face it, today's secular world is really riven through religious ideology, riven with the religious ideology, just as religious ideologies themselves take on certain secular precepts. Religious nationalism itself is a hyphenated construction where you are talking about the primacy of the nation state, which has really fundamentally transformed what it means to be religious, right? In the sense that when you begin to identify a nation state requires a single identity, whether it be Christian or Buddhist in the name of culture or what have you, that really transforms the self-perception of the Christians, and then therefore the perception that the minority is the problem. Jews were made into precisely into that kind of, were the victims of that, right? That in moments of great political change and duress, you can actually select a group and say, you are the problem. We have seen the example of that in this country in terms of the racial hatred and the system of apartheid that existed. So I feel like in order to build those bridges, we have to actually be equally critical of how secular ideology also is the problem rather than always the solution, and whether all religions are the problem rather than the solution. We have to be ecumenical, truly ecumenical in the sense of across religious and secular divides.
Thank you. Thank you. I need to tell you I'm in line because I couldn't stand seeing no women in line.
Thank you. Good.
I had to get online.
But you're breaking the microphone.
That would be like me, yes. I'm humbly, not representing any organization. I asked this question in the spirit of a 7th grade catechist for 5 years. But also the mother of a daughter who graduated from all public school grades. And it was both Mr. Zuckerman and Ms. Mahmood who really prompted this question and this thought process. And before I ask my question, I just want to give profound respect to all of the religious leaders and volunteers who are here today, because we need you. So here's my question. In that spirit, we need to be aware of the kids and the challenges that they are facing, and how we are actually, I think, somewhat out of sync in the way we are approaching them about a lot of these big questions. They are smart. They are asking hard.
Can you give us an example and then ask a question?
Well, so they're very educated in science right now, for instance. And I'm talking even 7th graders. And so when things that, we're being handed to teach them conflict with maybe some of their scientific questions or knowledge that they're getting in school, or the fact, as Mr. Zuckerman points out, they go to school with all kinds of kids, and they have good friends with all kinds of religions. They don't understand why when they come into religious class, there starts to get to be a feeling of, this is the one truth, this is the one way. And you will not be saved, or you will not, So we need to, I would love to have this same forum for 7th grade to 17-year-olds. So could you just react to how do we challenge that? One other thing I just want to say, the other challenge for at least kids in this, what I call affluent area anyway, where I live in Virginia, is they haven't suffered. So understanding suffering or even talking about suffering and developing empathy is actually a bit of a challenge.
I'm kind of surprised that you get that kind of handout of the only you will be saved. It's kind of not the message that is prevalent today. But does anybody want to talk about that?
That's what the kids
Well,
are
I think
hearing. It's
two
not
things.
just in the class.
I mean, I'd be petrified to go before 7th graders, let me tell you that. I'm much more at home here. And all of these people have children and I don't, so I'm not going to push that too far. But I think you're absolutely right that their experience today is much more pluralistic than anything I experienced growing up. And secondly, the intensity of the educational process, if they're lucky enough to be in a good school system, pushes them much farther than they raised questions that I probably didn't deal with till college. So it introduces a dimension of imperative of how we deal with those kinds of questions. I think part of what it means to be a religious tradition, inevitably, religious traditions are particularistic in the sense of who's in them. They can be universalistic in terms of their vision of the world, so that when one is taught both the truth of one's own particular tradition and one is taught the recognition that there are other traditions that need to be respected. I also think that religious traditions offer the opportunity to speak of those questions of differences in human living standards that people experience in other parts of the world. I sometimes say that Catholics learn about social justice through the second collection on Sunday. That is to say, what we ask you to give money for. So it would happen in our parish that we took up a collection for the Central African Republic last Sunday as our Lenten gift, because we had had a priest in the parish who is now a bishop in the Central African Republic, and he writes back to the parish about what he's putting up. So people who may never have heard of the Central African Republic before last Sunday at least heard about it in one place and were asked to do something about it.
Phil,
Can I just address one nuance, though? That
actually, we really are out of time. I'm sorry. And the rest of you, you're going to have to bring your questions to the tents outside. Phil, you wanted to... No, go ahead. So
my response was having 3 kids of my own. And there's interesting psychological studies that show that children learn what religion they are far sooner than they know the content of that religion. So they learn they're Catholic before they even know what that means. They learn they're Jewish before they even know what that means. They learn they're Christian or Muslim from their parents, and that becomes their team. So there's an identification with that's my team. They don't even know the content of it. They just know their LDS before they even know what are the tenets, what are the values, what are the beliefs, what are the teachings, and it becomes, and so what I saw in my public school where my kids were, it's just what team are you on? Do you go to church? Are you Christian? Are you Jewish? What team are you? And I saw it as a very divisive way that children divided themselves up. So not even, who's right, who's going to be saved, who's going to hell. My kids got that too. My kids were told they were going to hell by many of their schoolmates in the courtyard. But I saw it and I was saddened by that. So even though there's the beauty of the tradition, my daughter's going to get bat mitzvahed in 2 months, I still see the division that comes with that religious, group, what religion are you, instead of seeing their common humanity. And maybe it's unavoidable, but I would like a world in which 2nd graders were not dividing themselves by the religion of their parents.
I want to give you a counter story. My story. In my family, I'm Muslim. From my background, my side of the family, my husband has both Jewish mother and a Christian father. My child has been raised, and I remember telling him all 3 traditions and teaching him that.
Child of Abraham.
And child of Abraham, indeed. But I remember still, he was 4 years old, and somebody asked him, and he said, I think I'm a quarter Christian, a quarter Jewish, and half Muslim. Go figure.
And that is the way of America, frankly. I mean, having raised Jewish Catholic children myself, who are now middle-aged people, but under 5, we are a majority minority country. And so the tolerance that is likely to emerge from that, we're already seeing it with our kids in school today, and the tolerance that's likely to emerge from that is very heartening. And with an elect, we'll never be the CAR, but thank you for your good work there, and thank all of you for doing this panel. It's been very, very interesting. Thanks a lot.